Berlin, 1945. A city that was once a symbol of power and culture had become a nightmare of rubble, fire, and death. The streets were unrecognizable, the buildings collapsed, and the air was thick with smoke and despair. Amidst this apocalyptic scene, the Red Army advanced with relentless fury, determined to take the capital of the Third Reich. But what the Soviet soldiers would encounter would not only be the resistance of a dying regime, but the darkest horrors humanity had ever seen. The bombings, the house-to-house fighting, and the suffering of millions of civilians were just the prelude to a discovery that would forever change our understanding of evil: the concentration camps. These scenes of indescribable barbarity were the place where thousands of souls had been exterminated in absolute silence. Berlin would fall, but the price would be unimaginable. In this military history video, we'll travel to the heart of the destruction to learn firsthand about the brutal Soviet advance toward the German capital, the devastating impact on civilians, and the unimaginable horrors that awaited them in the concentration camps. A story of destruction, suffering, and a legacy that must never be forgotten. Let's begin. There was a time when Berlin shone like the jewel of Europe. Its grand avenues, like Unter den Linden, were alive with life. The Brandenburg Gate stood imposingly as a symbol of grandeur, and the bustle of its cafes and theaters echoed a vibrant city. But that capital city of culture, art, and pride was gone. By 1945, what remained was a city in ruins, a charred shadow of its former self. Rubble piled up where buildings had once stood. The screams of children and women cried out from makeshift shelters, and the gray war sky enveloped everything in an overwhelming silence. Soviet soldiers witnessed this brutal contrast. Advancing from the east, they had already seen too much: burned fields, razed villages, and millions dead. But nothing prepared them for what they would find in Germany. Their entry into the heart of the Third Reich was not just a military conquest, it was also a confrontation with the horrors of humanity, the result of a regime that had taken suffering and barbarism beyond any known limits. The Soviet offensive toward Berlin began with relentless fury in January 1945. Stalin had given a clear order: the Reich capital must fall, whatever the cost. With more than 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and crushing artillery, the Red Army advanced, leaving total destruction in its wake. The German towns that stood in their way were consumed by the fire of bombing and fighting. The Nazi forces resisted fiercely, but could do little against a military machine that had gained brutal experience during 4 years of war on the Eastern Front. The advance toward Berlin was hellish for both sides. Battle-hardened Russian soldiers fought with a thirst for revenge for the millions of their compatriots killed during the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. But they also paid a heavy price. The road to Berlin was riddled with mines, traps, and counterattacks that claimed the lives of tens of thousands. The word mercy had lost its meaning amid the brutality.
The assault began with a shattering artillery bombardment as 2.5 million Russians moved into position for the final offensive. 1.5 million of these soldiers were under the orders of the Red Army's most experienced battlefield commanders, Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Koniev.
Both commanders had a clear and unequivocal mission, ordered directly from the Kremlin, to seize Hitler's operations center, crush the last Nazi resistance, and raise the red flag over Berlin. The Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of war and a hunger for revenge, advanced with a purpose that seemed almost inhuman: to erase the legacy of the Third Reich from the face of the earth. The capital would become the scene of the last and most brutal battle of World War II. On April 16th, the final siege of Berlin began. The sky turned red and black as the bombardment began. More than 22,000 Soviet artillery pieces roared in unison, creating a roar that shook the earth and broke the spirit of the German defenders. It was the prelude to the final assault, a storm of fire and metal that heralded the fall of the heart of the Third Reich.
Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, there was little for the Führer to celebrate. Zhukov and his men had made a rapid advance from the Seelau Heights and were already shelling the centre of Berlin with long-range artillery.
The strategy left no room for failure. The Reichstag, a symbol of desperate German resistance, had been transformed into a fortress filled with men ready to fight to the death. But for the Red Army, this was just another obstacle. Zhukov's men advanced relentlessly from the east, while Konev closed the pincer from the south. The plan was simple: encircle and suffocate Berlin. Every building would be a battlefield, every street a river of blood. There would be no mercy. The city, already devastated by Allied bombing, became a chaotic battlefield. Every street, every building was a potential target for the Russians. Soviet bombing, combined with desperate German resistance, turned Berlin into a hellish place. Explosions filled the air, debris rained down, and civilians ran for cover in basements and subway stations, which soon became graves for many. Berlin was a sea of ruins and death. On May 2nd, 1945, when the Soviets finally entered the heart of the city, they found an apocalyptic landscape. The Brandenburg Gate still stood, but it was burned and surrounded by rubble. The Reichstag, the symbol of political power, had been turned into a fortress filled with corpses. The streets were deserted, and the smell of death permeated everything. The people of Berlin faced unspeakable suffering. Women, the elderly, and children had been trapped in the city. With men sent to the front or killed in battle, they were the ones dealing with hunger, lack of water, and the constant threat of bombing. Children wandered the streets alone, searching for food in the rubble or among the bodies of the dead. Many took refuge in ruined buildings or subway tunnels, where the air was almost unbreathable. Soviet soldiers, upon entering the city, brought not only war, but also a glimmer of aid. Amid the chaos, they began distributing food and water to civilians. Although tensions between conquerors and conquered were palpable, some soldiers demonstrated humanity in a situation that seemed to have lost it completely. However, there were also abuses and rapes, episodes that left an indelible scar on the memories of the German population. When the war ended, more than 40 million people in Europe were destitute, many of them in Germany. Entire families had been destroyed, entire cities had disappeared, and the majority of the German population was scarred by the trauma of war and the weight of having been part of a regime that had caused so much devastation. The advance toward Berlin and their conquest of the city were brutal, but the Soviets found true horror when they liberated the concentration camps. In January 1945, Soviet troops reached the Auschwitz extermination camp in Poland. What they found there defied comprehension: piles of bodies, crematoriums filled with human ashes, and thousands of prisoners who seemed barely alive. They were walking skeletons covered in rags, their eyes devoid of hope.
One of the most shocking parts of the Second World War was what the Red Army and the Allies would find as they took Nazi-occupied territory. Throughout 1945, the enemies of the Third Reich would stumble across a number of concentration camps, which would display the sheer horror of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust.
The silence at Auschwitz was deafening. The soldiers, who had endured the worst brutalities of the war, were paralyzed by what they saw. The survivors, mostly Jews, were too weak even to speak. Many died within days of liberation, unable to bear the weight of hunger and disease they had endured for months or years. The Soviets documented everything they found: the gas chambers, the louse-infested barracks, and the victims' luggage, piled up as a macabre memento of the lives that had been taken. Let's hear a first-person account of the horror from a Soviet officer serving his homeland who had no idea what he would find.
Cuando nos íbamos acercando al campo ya se sentía ese olor tan especial como a carne quemada, a carne humana quemada. Ese olor impregnaba todo el campo.
It was a smell so pungent and nauseating that it seemed to cling to their skin. As they advanced, the silhouettes of the crematoriums began to emerge through the winter mist, and what they saw there would be forever etched in their memories. The first thing they saw were the piled-up bodies, blackened by the fire that had tried to erase the evidence of the genocide. Around them, the barracks seemed to devour the little light that remained in that nightmarish place. The few survivors who still lived were walking shadows, almost unreal. Every corner of the camp was a macabre scene. The gas chambers, the crematoriums, the piles of shoes and suitcases of the exterminated prisoners. Everything spoke of a system so calculated and cold that it seemed impossible for it to have been created by human beings. The Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of war and accustomed to brutality, were paralyzed. Many refused to believe what they saw.
Nos quedamos cara a cara. Tenían los rostros ennegrecidos, algunos estaban cubiertos con mantas o colchas, y de pronto nos fijamos en sus ojos. Nos dimos cuenta de que los tenían brillantes.
The encounter with Auschwitz not only marked the end of a phase in the war, it also marked the beginning of a bitter and painful realization. That place revealed to the world the depths of human barbarism. For the Soviets who liberated the camp, that day was not a victory. It was a direct confrontation with the purest evil, with the unbearable weight of what it meant to witness genocide. Auschwitz remained an open wound, a reminder of what happens when hatred becomes a system. And for soldiers like Ivan Martinushkin, that day between the smell of death and the shining eyes of the survivors was a day they could never forget. For their part, the return of the German people to their homeland was a journey filled with shadows. Fear and shame mingled in their gaze, fear of an uncertain future under the occupation of their enemies, and shame for being natives of a land that had been stained with the blood of millions. The scars of the bombings were everywhere, but the invisible marks, those they carried in their souls, were even deeper. Germany, once proud, was now a fragmented nation, broken and sinking under the weight of its own crimes. For many, returning didn't mean finding a home, but rather facing the judgment of history, a judgment that is still being written today.
For many Jews, Germany is the blood-soaked earth upon which they will never set foot again. Others return to the land of the criminals and build new Jewish communities, but they are few and far between.
The fall of Berlin and the horrors uncovered by the Soviets not only marked the end of one of the most brutal wars in history, but also revealed the extent of human cruelty in its darkest form. The destruction, the suffering of millions, and the unimaginable scenes in the concentration camps left indelible scars, not only on the survivors, but also on the conscience of humanity. It is a reminder that, even in victory, war never has true winners, only victims and lessons we must never forget. And now, after learning this incredible story of the horrors and brutality that Russian soldiers witnessed upon entering Germany, and how they faced the destruction, human suffering, and liberation of the concentration camps, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for being with us until the end. We look forward to seeing you in our next military history video.